All right, so for this part of the video, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a little chart that kind of shows you guys some of the rules that I'm talking about when you're working with the domain. When you're working with domains of a function. So the first one we're gonna talk about is polynomials. So when you're working with a polynomial, for example, you have x squared plus 5x plus 6. So what you need to know when you're working with the domain for a problem like this is that your value of the domain is going to be all real numbers. So it's going to be represented as negative infinity to infinity, or all real numbers, because since you have a polynomial, you don't have to worry about this being undefined or anything making this not a real number or a complex value. Your domain is going to be represented by all real numbers. So this one's a super easy one, and so when you're working with problems like this and you're trying to identify problems, and if you have just something written out and there's no root and there's no fraction, it's going to be pretty straightforward, and then your domain is just going to be represented as all real numbers. So then for the next one, we're going to be talking about when you're working with fractions. So now fractions is where it starts getting just a little bit trickier. So an example that you might see, if you have like f of x is equal to x squared plus 4 divided by x squared plus 4x minus 3. If you have like a problem like this, what you're gonna have to remember to do, just anything with any type of equation in the fraction, you are going to set the denominator equal to 0, and then exclude whatever values that make f of x undefined. So when you're solving it, you're setting the denominator equal to 0, but ultimately what you actually want is you want your denominator to not be equal to 0. So that's really what you're looking for in the equation, is whatever values make your denominator not equal to 0. All right, and so then for number 3, we're going to talk about having a square root only, just meaning that the only part of the problem that you're dealing with is a square root. So when you're dealing with a square root in your equation, like if you're working with f of x is equal to x plus 7, in order to find the domain of this function, you want to set the part of the function that's under the root to be greater than or equal to 0. So what this will do when you solve this will just make sure that all of the values that you're going to get in your domain are going to be positive, because again, you cannot have a negative value under a square root. And so in order to find the domain of a square root function, you want to make sure that you're setting the part of the function that's under the square root to be greater than or equal to 0 in order to make sure that you're not getting any negatives in your domain. All right, so then now what we're going to talk about is if you have a square root Sorry, I forgot to put a number 4 in front of here. So now what we're going to talk about is if you have a square root on the bottom of a fraction. So when you're doing a problem like this, an example of a square root on the bottom of a fraction would be f of x is equal to, say we have x squared, or x, whatever, x squared on the top, divided by root x plus 4. Now to find the domain of a problem like this, what you're going to do is you're going to set it so that when you're solving for your domain, that your domain is greater than 0, but not greater than or equal to 0, because you also want to make sure that your domain is not going to equal 0. So you're going to set this x plus 4, instead of on this problem where you would do x plus 7 is greater than or equal to 0, and you would solve that. For this problem, what you're going to do is you're going to do x plus 4 is just greater than 0, and that's how you find the domain of a problem like that. And now finally, the last problem that we're going to be working with for the domain that I have a rule for is if you're going to have a square root on top of a fraction. So an example of a problem that might look like this, make sure it's even, is if you were to have a square root of, say you had like f of x equals x plus 1 divided by x squared minus 4. Say if you had a problem like this, the way that you're going to find the domain for a problem like this is first you want to make sure that for the domain, you want to make sure that the bottom of the fraction, so you're going to set it so the bottom of the fraction is not equal to 0, and then the top of the fraction is going to be greater than or equal to 0, and then you find the answer for both of these, and then you take the intersection. So for a problem like this, I'll go over how you would take the intersection and exactly what you would do in terms of finding the problem. But I just wanted to set up some basic rules for finding the domain that you can look back on when you're studying and stuff, and especially for exams, this will probably be really helpful because this is just the rules that you need to remember when you're solving for the domain. So remember, if you have a square root and only a square root, that you're going to make sure that you are getting positive values in the domain of this function. And then if you have a fraction, no matter what, you want to make sure that the bottom, the denominator of your fraction is not equal to 0. So you're going to find whatever values of x will be excluded to make sure that the function is not undefined. So I hope this video helps, and then the next couple videos I'm going to go through and I'm going to do different problems for each one of these, and I'm going to go through how you would find the solution and the problems I'm going to get from WebAssign and Cengage and problems that you guys have sent me. So I'm just going to go through and explain how you get the domain of each function and how you would write those.